In the last video, I talked about this shot not being auto-trackable, which is true. But I also said it couldn't be solved with just supervised tracking, and we'd have to jump through a bunch of hoops. Well, that is not true. I did solve it with just supervised trackers, but it required me to listen to my own advice. Add more trackers. Anyone who has followed me when it comes to the subject of tracking has heard me give this advice to people asking for guidance. You need to add more trackers. I'd love to jump right into it, but first I wanted to let Jeremy Thompson introduce his footage. Jeremy's been in the advertising industry for years, working as a designer and cinematographer. He told me he's donated this footage for his own short film to help other filmmakers. So here's Jeremy.
Yeah, the shot is basically, it's a shot that was coming out, pointing down, and I tried to track it. But this one in particular was very, very difficult. And I remember thinking, like, I think I must have tried to solve it maybe 10 to 15 times. I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to move on and do this. I'm gonna have to do this by hand. I'm gonna have to go into Maya and just like by hand. And even, I tried that, it wasn't working.
I'll tell you this. So I got your footage and I looked at it and I was like, oh yeah, this isn't gonna be that big of a deal. That's gonna be fine. So every shot I get in the world of film and TV, I treat this way. During the bidding process, I bring them into Synthesize. If they look like they'll auto-solve, I'll hit the auto button. And if they auto-solve, that affects the bid. You know, most of the work is gonna be administrative work, and it's gonna be QC work, and it's gonna be tweaking things. So the bid will be much lower. If the shot doesn't auto-solve, well then I'll really evaluate how difficult is this gonna be. Well, I did that with your shot. So I brought it in and I'm like, all right, hit auto. I'm like, oh yeah, that didn't work at all. And I knew it wouldn't because you got that whip pan in there. And as soon as you hit all that motion blur, it's never gonna work, but that's just the standard operating procedure. So I did that and then I was like, all right, well, let's get in a little deeper and we'll lay out some supervised trackers and we'll see. And then I just kept going and I added more and more and more supervised trackers to the point where I was like, all right, I've got enough coverage of supervised trackers to really pull off a solution if it's possible. And I hit the solve button and then I sent you back the scene file. So you've seen that. All right, so I have brought up my first attempt at this. I'm not gonna go through all of these trackers you see here. I'm not gonna individually track them in front of you. If you wanna see me tracking individual trackers, go back to my tutorial on how to do supervised tracking. It's all going to be that. So we have a bunch of trackers in here. I'm just gonna hit play. There we go. The camera backs up from the wall and then it pans over to the left, but it doesn't just pan over to the left, does it? At least not in this solve. You can see the camera like pulls back and then it does this crazy move. Let's talk about a few other things. This point cloud of this section, that doesn't look like the hallway of the alley. This is terrible. I always think of camera tracking, 3D camera tracking, and object tracking for that matter, as motion capture. You're doing motion capture after the fact, based on 2D image data. That's it. And then you're putting in your trackers, whether they be auto tracks or supervised trackers, but you get the result of some kind of performance capture. Now here, I think that this performance capture is probably accurate. That looks like what Jeremy had to have done. He pointed the camera at the wall and he stepped back, and then this is where he whip panned. Now, I talked to him about this and I said, my guess is that you didn't just like whip over your whole body over to the left, and then you did not step to the side, and then you did not back up while you were turning.
That is correct.
So that being the case, we know that this is not accurate in terms of just the motion that it captured, but I just want to keep that in mind, that I look at 3D camera tracking as motion capture for the camera operator. This is my second attempt, and just by adding more trackers, we can see that at least the hallway's starting to come more into place. somewhat. We still have these goofy trackers way off in the distance. We know that those aren't right, but just by adding more trackers, we're starting to get something that feels more like it should. People ask, like, what's the minimum number of trackers you need to pull off a track? And technically, it hovers somewhere between 9 and 12, but that's not gonna be true for every shot. You see that the numbers jump from 60 to 181. Why? Well, sometimes what I'll do is at some point I'll say, hey, you know what, let's go into the features tab and, oh, look at that, I have a whole bunch of blips, and then I'll peel all, and then it'll give me a whole bunch of trackers there, and then I'll do a solve, and I'll see if those trackers help to the initial solve. And in this case, they did not. At one point, I made the suggestion, when you delete trackers after you've done an auto track, well, to start the count over. Like, so if you already have 60 trackers in there and you deleted all those trackers, make the next one 61, please. It doesn't do that. So we end up with these gaps between 60 and 181. You can change that very easily. If you go select all your trackers, there's a script for renumbering the trackers, renamed selected trackers, and then you can give it a name. The default name is tracker. You start at 1 and then rename and renumber, and it'll just go through and rename and renumber all of them if you just want to do tidy housekeeping. We're not gonna do that because I have given a specific tracker a name, tracker 186 crosshairs. Its lifetime is very short. If I go to this display toolbar and I hit crosshairs and I unlock the tracker, you can see that I added crosshairs to this tracker. Now, why did I add crosshairs to the tracker? Because if we look very closely at the pattern that I'm tracking this wire that's hanging out. Like, you can see there are these wires. I'm making the assumption that they're rigid, and I'm trying to get more parallax. So anything that is separated in space, I noticed that was closest to camera, and using all of the techniques that I show in my supervised tracking tutorial, I tracked this kink in the string. I'm keeping the crosshairs aligned with the motion blur, and it just helped me to track this feature. You can see that tracker is pretty on the money, and it's, like I said, separated from the background. So I'm trying to extract as much parallax as I can. So it's starting to look more like a hallway. By adding more trackers, I have created a more realistic space, like something that makes more sense. It just means you need to add more trackers. What I did on this version was I started to do lens distortion calculations. Lens distortion calculations can help bring down the error and get the points to line up better. We know this shot has lens distortion. We can just see it. With our naked eye, you can see that right in the footage. Let's go back to the beginning. Yeah, that's not a straight line. That's kind of bent out. In fact, I've done a lens distortion calculation, but I'm gonna go to the lens panel and I'm gonna right click and say view, show lens grid, and turn that off just to get it out of the way. But I'm going to add a line, and I'm gonna click and drag, and it's gonna add a line. Look, hey, look at that. That line lines up really well. As I move up, that line on that bent pole, which you can see with the naked eye, well, I drew a straight line in Synthesize, and it's because Synthesize had already calculated the distortion. And that number is right here. And I can change that number, and you can manually figure out a distortion number. So on shots where you really can't calculate distortion, or if you have a lens grid or whatever, you can just draw lines out and then twiddle the knob until it lines up, and there, that's your distortion number. But don't do that, because Synthesize will calculate that distortion for you at solve time. How does it do it? I talked about it in my previous supervised tracking tutorials. So Synthesize knows where those 2D tracker centers are, and the center of that 2D tracker as it approaches the corners of the frame and the edges at the top and bottom. It then can compare that to the 3D point locations, which are always going to be a best fit because the initial calculation is based on an infinitely small pinhole camera, like a computer camera that you'd find in Maya, 3D Studio Max, Cinema 4D, Blender, whatever. Well, Synthesize starts there, and then it can compare the 3D point to where the 2D tracker is, and as the 3D point starts slipping out of the center of the tracker as you get toward the edges of the frame, Synthesize can measure that, and then it can say, oh, okay, I can just graph that, and then, oh, there, here's the number. All right, so here is this version, and this is even more trackers. Our error has dropped a little bit, so everything we can do to keep the error coming down, just adding more trackers. Our hallway is starting to take shape. Our hallway's looking good from all 3 views. We still have some goofy, we know that these are not in the right position, but we're gonna talk about that in a bit. That's version 5 with even more trackers. So I'm gonna load the next version. Oh my gosh, well that looks terrible. What happened? Here's what happened. In all the previous versions, I had set the solver mode to refine. And then I tried it at automatic. Sometimes I'll do that. I'll have a shot that I've been refining, and then I'll go back to automatic and see how well it solves. And by adding all those additional trackers, it just demolishes the solution. So that's not good. Does not look like our hallway. Everything is wrong. If you're ever in a shot and you add a bunch more trackers and then it suddenly just explodes your solution, don't panic. Undo the solution, switch your solver mode to refine. That will solve the problem. So I did do that, I undid, and then I'm going to bring up the next version. This is that version. I've added even more trackers, and now you'll see it's in refine mode. And so now our solution is pretty good. Now, I've got a bunch more trackers that say truncate this lifetime. So this tracker here, if you look at that little histogram in the bottom right corner for that individual tracker, you'll see that its error climbs way up. And it's also kind of way out in space. So what I'm going to do is, right when the whip pan starts here, you always hear me say, try to squeeze as much lifetime out of the tracker as possible. Just get as much as you can. But sometimes that too can be counterproductive. And only through experience will you learn these things. When it should be done, when it should not be done. If you're doing 2D tracking, like if I hired you as a junior tracker and you were just doing 2D tracking and then that gets passed off to the people who are doing the solutions and delivery of shots, make them as long as you can. Let that person downstream decide this tracker probably should be truncated. So I've said truncate this lifetime. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to the tracker tab, and we're tracking backward here. I'm going to unlock the tracker and I'm going to shut it off here just to truncate its lifetime. We're going to look back in the 3D view. We see that this tracker is kind of way off a little bit in the distance. I'm going to go to the solver and I'm going to hit refine. And we're going to see what happens to that tracker's location. Go. And if you paid attention, you saw it jump to a new position. Let's truncate this lifetime. That one's too far away too. So we're going to truncate that lifetime. We're going to do it right. We're going to truncate the lifetime right here. Why are we truncating it right there? Kind of like your parents said when you were a little kid. Because I said so. Really, it is. It's because I said so. It's because I'm deciding I'm going to try this and see if it works. And then I might undo that and I might move it a little bit more and I might try it again. So I'm going to turn that tracker off there. I'm going to lock it. I'm going to go back to the solver. We know that this is way off in the distance. I'm going to hit go on the refine. Oh, it just popped into a new position. Oh, look at that. It moved way forward. So now if I circle these two trackers, hey look, we know that in 3D space, this is probably more accurate. Let's go, now that I've truncated some trackers. I did that on a bunch more and I improved the shot. I kept improving the shot and kept improving the shot. So I'm gonna go to the next version. So all I've done here is add some geometry. And how did I add that card? Well, I'll get rid of the card and I'll show you. I'm just gonna delete the card and I'm going to go to Mesh, Add Cards. You have to do a little bit of a dance in deciding what trackers you want to select. We're gonna select only trackers that are on the wall and not on the pipes. How do we do that? Well, dexterity, that's it. So I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna select these, and I'm gonna select this one down here, get my lasso around that, and ignore that, and around this. Oh my God, this is ridiculous. You've gotta be kidding me. This is how you have to do this? Yes, this is how you have to do this. So, oh wait, oh, let's get around that one. Yeah, there we go. And around that one, and back down, there. So now we're only selecting those 3D points that are on the back wall, and we're ignoring the ones in the foreground. Let's change the color of this to white. I'm going to change this to, I don't know, 6, and this one will be 4. Great, there, so generally squares. But now that we can see that that isn't in the right location, and we wanted our scene to be aligned so that the wall is basically home base, that's where we're gonna go back to. We know that it's not aligned properly, so I'm gonna click Hole, and I'm going to click in the middle of this. Whoa, wait a minute, hold on a second. We want 3D Hole Effects Meshes. There we go, that's important. I usually leave that off, but sometimes it's necessary. So we're gonna have Hole Effects Meshes, and we're gonna rotate that around. Okay, and holding down the Control key while we do this gives us fine control. So that looks pretty good, it's not terrible. Now that we've got that lined up on that axis, let's look at it on this axis. And let's rotate this around until it looks like it's just a pixel. So now that that's aligned and we look at our space, we can see that our space is kind of shaped like a banana. That's not great, but again, you gotta set the expectation level. We don't have a set survey, we don't have LiDAR. We're going to have to make this as best as it can be so that it can pull off the shot. And you've got a robot hovering in the air and looking down the hall. This is gonna work. This version is called Attempt 1 version 9 QC geometry. So how did I build this geometry in here? Well, there's this, you know, I've got this point cloud and I've got all this neat geometry in the shot. I can lasso vertices here. So I can select individual polygons in my geometry that I've built. But how did I build that? Well, let's build it. Let's just rebuild it. So I'm gonna delete this. How did I make that object? Well, I'm gonna select all my trackers. And then in the toolbars, I have my mesh toolbar selected. You can do that right here, mesh. And I'm gonna say, with all my trackers selected, convert to mesh. There, a whole mess of vertices. So that's our object. Now, I'm gonna select the object. What do I always do? I change it to the color white. In the mesh, I can say, assemble mesh. Let's go to perspective. So when I'm in assemble mesh mode, I can click on vertices one at a time. So I'm gonna click on this vertex first, and then this vertex, and then this vertex. Voila, polygon, triangle in fact. And I can click on this one and it'll create another one. I'll create this, I'll click on another one, create that one, and I'll click on this one and it'll create that triangle. And it's a way that you can quickly go through and just make geometry. And that geometry you will use to just QC your shot, just to make sure that everything is lining up. Here's another thing you can do to create these a lot more quickly. I can say lasso vertices, and I can select a whole bunch of vertices on the ground. And from this view, I'm gonna say triangulate. Look, and it makes a big, messy, ugly, awful thing. So how is that useful? Well, I'll show you. Let's undo that. We're gonna go to quad perspective, and we're gonna change this left view to perspective B. And now we can look at our shot from other angles. Oh, look at that. So now that we have all these vertices, I'm gonna move my window windows a little bit. Whatever your view is, so if I'm looking at the top, right now here we're gimbal locked. I can't rotate any more than that. That basically means that I'm looking at it straight down as I can from a non-orthographic viewport. Now that I'm in this view, I can hit, we need the mesh menu in that window, and I'm gonna say triangulate. Oh, well look at that. That looks a lot more reasonable. So that's a fast way to quickly just make a bunch of triangles and do it in a way that kind of makes sense. So is it a ground plane? Is it a plane? No, not really. You can see, it's a little uneven. But life is uneven. Alleyways are uneven. There are bumps and humps and divots, and so keep that in mind. And let's now figure out how can we, make these vertices on this wall. How can we triangulate those? Well, we'd go into this view over here again, and we'd rotate around, and we'd say, oh yeah, that's probably pretty good. And in fact, we probably should select even more of these vertices. So I'm gonna say lasso vertices in this window, Shift, and I'm gonna select more of the vertices. Let's orbit around and make sure we didn't select any that aren't on the wall, like on those garbage cans. Look at those garbage cans, you can just see them there. They're just right here. Okay, now that we have that, I'm going to orbit around. It'll always orbit around like the bounding box of your selection, which is really nice. And then I'm going to hit triangulate again. There, hey look. Now we've got a bunch of triangulated points on the wall. Here, let's take this vertex and we'll say delete selected vertices. Because we know that, we don't want geometry that's occluded by other geometry in the front. This is just for QC purposes. That's pretty good. That looks all right. So this is kind of pretty much all I want to cover for this tutorial. How to get the shot up to a point where the track looks good. It looks like we could deliver it, like it's going to be useful for the shot. We've covered a lot in this video. I mentioned how 3D tracking to me is a form of performance capture for the camera operator. I talked about how many supervised trackers you really need. I talked about using tracker crosshairs. I began to talk about lens distortion calculations. I really talked about how you probably need to add more trackers. It's been a while since I made any of these tutorials, and making this one has taught me possibly more than it has taught you. What always happens is that I get started and then paying work comes in. So, lesson 1 for me, make shorter tutorials. In the near future, I'm gonna start covering only one thing at a time, possibly answering questions I see on the Synthesize Users Discord, link below, or in the comments here. So leave comments, or join the Discord and ask questions there, or do both. Many thanks again to Jeremy Thompson for providing the footage and putting a link to his website below. He's a really talented guy whom everyone should keep an eye on. In a planned follow-up to this video, I was going to cover how to fake a set survey, but I happened upon another Synthesize user on YouTube who did basically what I was going to do. There's a link to that below. So thank you for that, Kelvin Kingdon. Keep an eye out for him too, he's great. But thanks for watching. I hope that you learned something. If you did, hit the like button. And if you find me to be weird, I don't know, hit the weird button. That's it. I hope to see you in the next tutorial. And until then, be safe.